March 3, 1956, 2:47 p.m. Mayme Johnson was grocery shopping on 125th Street when three men in suits grabbed her. No warning, no negotiation. Just a black Cadillac, a chloroform rag, and the sound of her shopping bags hitting the pavement. By 3:15 p.m., every street soldier in Harlem knew what happened. By 3:30 p.m., Bumpy Johnson received the ransom call. By 9 p.m., Bumpy wanted into Vito Genovese's social club carrying a leather briefcase. He wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to deliver something that would make the most powerful mob boss in New York wish he'd never heard the name Mayme Johnson. What was in that briefcase changed the rules of organized crime forever.
And it all started 6 hours earlier, when Bumpy Johnson did something nobody expected. He smiled.
To understand what happened on March 3, 1956, you need to understand who Mayme Johnson was. She wasn't just Bumpy's wife. She was his conscience, his anchor, the only person in Harlem who could tell Bumpy Johnson he was wrong and make him listen. They met in 1948 at Wells Restaurant. Mayme was a school teacher from North Carolina, educated, elegant, soft-spoken, everything Bumpy wasn't. She'd come to Harlem to teach music at PS 139, and within a month, every hustler in the neighborhood was trying to get her attention. But Mayme wasn't interested in street life. She wanted stability, peace, a quiet life. Then Bumpy Johnson walked into her classroom one Tuesday afternoon.
He wasn't there to intimidate her. He was there because his nephew, Marcus, was failing music class, and Marcus's mother had begged Bumpy to talk to the teacher. Mayme looked at this man, dressed in a tailored suit, gold watch chain, reputation preceding him like thunder, and said 6 words that changed his life. "Your nephew needs to practice more." Not, "Mr. Johnson, I'm honored." Not, "I'll pass him." Just the truth. Bumpy fell in love right there. It took him 6 months to convince her to have dinner with him, another year to convince her to marry him. And when they got married in 1949, Bumpy made her a promise. "I'll never bring my business into our home."
For 7 years, he kept that promise. Mayme knew what Bumpy did. She wasn't naive. But their home on Edgecombe Avenue was sacred. No guns, no meetings, no violence. Just a husband and wife living as normal a life as Bumpy Johnson could manage. Until March 3, 1956. That morning, Bumpy had a meeting with Frank Costello downtown. They were negotiating terms on a new policy bank operation. Standard business. Mayme kissed him goodbye at 9 a.m., told him she'd make his favorite dinner, fried chicken and collard greens. "I'll pick up groceries this afternoon," she said. "Be safe," Bumpy replied.
Those were the last words they exchanged before everything changed. 2:47 p.m. Mayme walked out of Morrison's Market on 125th Street, carrying 2 bags of groceries. She was wearing a blue dress, pearls, white gloves. She looked like Sunday morning in the middle of a Tuesday. The black Cadillac pulled up to the curb. 3 men got out. Not Harlem men. Italian. You could tell by the suits, the shoes, the way they moved. Confident. Too confident. The first man grabbed Mayme's left arm. The second took her right. The third pressed a cloth to her face. Chloroform. Sweet, chemical smell. Mayme tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. Her bags hit the sidewalk. Oranges rolled into the gutter. Eggs cracked and spread across the concrete.
17 people witnessed it. Old Mrs. Patterson from the beauty shop, young Tommy Wright delivering newspapers, even Officer Henderson, a beat cop who was 2 blocks away. But nobody moved, because those 3 men, they were Carlo Gambino's soldiers, and you didn't interfere with Gambino family business unless you wanted to die. The Cadillac sped off, 2:51 p.m. Mrs. Patterson ran to the nearest payphone, dropped a nickel, dialed a number she'd memorized years ago, the number only used for emergencies. "They took her," Mrs. Patterson said when the voice answered. "They took Mayme Johnson." The line went dead. Within minutes, the word spread through Harlem like wildfire, not through phones, through people.
Runners, lookouts, street soldiers.
The network Bumpy had built over 20 years activated instantly.
By 3:15 p.m., Bumpy Johnson was sitting in Frank Costello's office when his lieutenant, Willie Thompson, burst through the door. "Boss, they took Mayme." Bumpy went still. Not angry still, calculating still, the kind of stillness that comes before an earthquake. "Who?" "Gambino's men, 3 soldiers, grabbed her on 125th in broad daylight." Frank Costello, who'd been mid-sentence about policy bank percentages, slowly set down his cigar. "Bumpy, I didn't authorize this." "I know," Bumpy said quietly, "because you're smart." He stood up, buttoned his jacket. "Carlo isn't." Costello leaned forward. "Don't do anything stupid. Let me make some calls. We'll negotiate. She'll be home by dinner."
Bumpy looked at Costello with eyes that had seen 20 years of war, betrayal, and survival. "Frank, if Carlo Gambino wanted to negotiate, he would have called me first. He took my wife to send a message, so I'm going to send one back." "What message?" "That some lines you don't cross." 3:28 p.m. The phone in Bumpy's Edgecombe Avenue home rang. Bumpy answered on the second ring. "Johnson?" The voice on the other end was thick with a Brooklyn accent. Confident. Too confident. "Mr. Johnson? My name is Tony Anastasia. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Carlo Gambino." "Where is she?" "Your wife is safe. Comfortable. We're not animals." "Where is she?"
Tony paused. "That depends on you, Mr. Johnson. See, Mr. Gambino has a proposal. He wants to expand his operations into Harlem, the numbers game specifically. He's prepared to offer you a very generous partnership, 30% of the profits." "Not interested." "You didn't let me finish." "I don't need to. I've heard this pitch before. Dutch Schultz tried it, Vito Genovese tried it, Lucky Luciano tried it. You know what they all learned? Silence. That Harlem isn't for sale, and the price of trying to take it is higher than any of you can afford." Tony's voice hardened. "Mr. Johnson, I don't think you understand your position. We have your wife."
Bumpy smiled. Nobody in the room could see it, but they could hear it in his voice. "And I have 6 hours to get her back before you realize what a mistake that was." "Is that a threat?" "No, Tony. It's a countdown. Tell Carlo I'll be at his social club at 9 p.m. sharp. I'll bring what he wants." "What's that?" "Proof that he should have left Mayme Johnson alone." The line went dead. Willie Thompson, who'd been standing in the doorway, stepped forward. "Boss, what's the play?" "We can hit their warehouses, grab some of their guys, force a trade."
Bumpy shook his head. "No. If we go to war, Mayme gets hurt. Carlo knows that. He's counting on it." "So what do we do?" Bumpy walked to his desk, opened the bottom drawer, pulled out a leather briefcase. The same briefcase he'd carried for 15 years. The one that had been to meetings with Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky. The one that held secrets. "We remind Carlo Gambino why nobody touches my family." 4 p.m. Bumpy made 5 phone calls. Each one lasted less than 60 seconds. Each one set a piece of the plan in motion. The first call went to Detective Raymond Taylor, an NYPD cop who'd been on Bumpy's payroll for a decade. "Ray, I need a favor."
The second call went to Judge Howard Mitchell, a man who owed Bumpy for keeping his gambling addiction out of the newspapers. "Howard, remember that conversation we had in 1952? The third call went to Samuel Rothstein, a Jewish accountant who managed the books for half the mob families in New York. "Sam, I need access to the Gambino family's financial records, everything." The fourth call went to Maria Esposito, a grandmother who ran a bakery on Mulberry Street. She also happened to be Carlo Gambino's aunt. "Maria, it's Bumpy. I need you to make a phone call to your nephew. Tell him I know about the thing he did in 1948.
The fifth call went to Father Patrick O'Malley, a Catholic priest who'd grown up in Harlem and owed Bumpy for saving his church from foreclosure. "Father, I need you to hear a confession. Not mine, his. By 5:30 p.m., Bumpy had everything he needed. Not guns, not soldiers, information. Because Bumpy Johnson understood something that most gangsters didn't. Violence is temporary. Fear is forever. And the most terrifying weapon you can use against a man isn't a bullet. It's the truth he's been hiding.
6:15 p.m. Bumpy opened the leather briefcase, began organizing the contents, photographs, documents, tape recordings, each piece carefully selected, each one more damaging than the last. Willie Thompson watched from across the room. "Boss, what is all that?" "Insurance," Bumpy said quietly. "For the last 15 years, every time someone tried to threaten me, betray me, or take what's mine, I didn't retaliate immediately. I documented. I gathered evidence. I waited." He held up a photograph. It showed Carlo Gambino shaking hands with a man in an FBI jacket. This was taken in 1954. Carlo was feeding information to the feds about his rivals in exchange for protection.
Willie's eyes widened. If that gets out, every family in New York will want him dead. The commission will order his execution. His own soldiers will turn on him. Bumpy pulled out another document. Bank statements. This shows Carlo embezzling $2 million from the Gambino family coffers over 3 years, money his own people don't know is missing. Another photograph. This is Carlo's mistress, a woman named Angela Russo. She's 19 years old, also the daughter of Salvatore Russo, Carlo's underboss. Willie whistled low. Sal would kill him. Slowly, Bumpy agreed.
He pulled out a tape recorder, pressed play. Carlo's voice filled the room. "I don't care what Anastasia says. When the time is right, I'm taking over. Albert's getting old, sloppy. 1 bullet, 1 new boss." Willie stared. "That's a confession to planning the murder of his own boss." Bumpy nodded. "Recorded 6 months ago at a meeting in New Jersey. Carlo thought the room was clean. It wasn't. He placed everything back in the briefcase, closed it carefully. You see, Willie, violence makes men angry, but secrets make them terrified. Because anger fades, secrets don't."
7:30 p.m. Bumpy called the Gambino Social Club one more time. Tony Anastasia answered. "Change of plans," Bumpy said. "I want proof of life." "What?" "Put Mayme on the phone. Now." There was muffled conversation, footsteps, then Mayme's voice. Calm, steady. "Ellsworth? Are you hurt?" "No. They've been civil." "Good. I'll have you home in 2 hours." "Ellsworth, don't do anything foolish." Bumpy smiled. "I never do, sweetheart. I love you. I love you too."
The line switched back to Tony. "Satisfied? Tell Carlo I'm on my way." "And Tony?" "Yeah? If there's a single bruise on her when I get there, what I'm about to show Carlo will seem merciful compared to what I'll do to you." 8:45 p.m. Bumpy Johnson walked out of his Edgecombe Avenue home carrying the leather briefcase. He was alone. No bodyguards, no soldiers, no weapons. Just the briefcase and the certainty of a man who'd been underestimated his entire life. He walked to his car, a midnight blue Lincoln Continental, and drove downtown. The streets of Manhattan blurred past. Streetlights, neon signs. People living normal lives, unaware that in 15 minutes, the balance of power in New York's underworld was about to shift.
8:59 p.m. Bumpy Johnson pulled up to the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, Carlo Gambino's fortress. 3 soldiers stood outside, arms crossed, watching him park. Bumpy stepped out of the Lincoln, briefcase in hand, and walked toward the entrance like he owned the building. The soldiers moved to block him. "He's expecting me," Bumpy said simply. The lead soldier, a thick-necked enforcer named Paulie, sneered. "We need to search you first." Bumpy sold out his arms. "Go ahead." Paulie patted him down roughly. No weapons. He grabbed the briefcase. "What's in here?" "Answers," Bumpy said. "Now take me to your boss."
The inside of the Ravenite was exactly what you would expect. Dark wood paneling, cigar smoke hanging in the air like fog, oil paintings of Italian countryside on the walls. A dozen soldiers sat at tables playing cards, drinking espresso, pretending not to watch as Bumpy walked through. But they were watching. Everyone was watching. Because this was unprecedented. A black man walking into the heart of the Gambino family's territory, alone. Carlo Gambino sat in the back room, a private office behind a thick oak door. Tony Anastasia stood beside him, hand resting on his waistband. And sitting in the corner, unharmed, but visibly shaken, was Mayme Johnson. Her blue dress was wrinkled. Her pearls were still perfect.
When she saw Bumpy, relief flooded her face. But Bumpy didn't look at her yet. He looked at Carlo.
Carlo Gambino was 54 years old in 1956, thin, sharp-featured, with eyes like a snake watching a mouse. He was everything Dutch Schultz wasn't. Patient, calculated, dangerous in ways that didn't announce themselves. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Mr. Johnson, please, sit." Bumpy remained standing. "I'm not here for a meeting, Carlo. I'm here for my wife." "All in good time. First, we discuss business." "There's nothing to discuss." Carlo's smile was thin, reptilian. "I think there is. You see, Mr. Johnson, Harlem represents a significant revenue opportunity. The numbers racket alone generates millions annually. And you, controlling it all by yourself, that's inefficient." Bumpy set the briefcase on Carlo's desk. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "Open it," Bumpy said. Carlo glanced at Tony, who stepped forward cautiously, unlatched the briefcase, lifted the lid. His face went pale. Carlo leaned forward, looked inside, and for the first time in the conversation, his expression changed. The confidence evaporated. "Where did you get this?" "That doesn't matter," Bumpy said quietly. "What matters is what I do with it." He pulled out the first photograph, the one showing Carlo shaking hands with the FBI agent, and placed it on the desk. 1954, Brooklyn. You fed the Bureau information about Albert Anastasia's operations in exchange for immunity from a racketeering charge.
Carlo's jaw tightened. That's fabricated. The date stamp is right there. The FBI file number is on the back. I have 3 witnesses who can verify it, including the agent. Bumpy pulled out the bank statements next. $2 million, embezzled from family accounts over 3 years. Your underboss, Sal Russo, has no idea, but he will tomorrow morning unless we reach an understanding tonight. Tony's hand moved toward his gun, but Carlo raised a finger. Don't. Bumpy continued, pulling out the photograph of Carlo with the young woman. Angela Russo, Sal's daughter, your mistress. She's 19, you're 54, and married. I wonder how Sal would react to finding out you've been sleeping with his little girl.
Carlo's voice was ice. "You're playing a dangerous game, Johnson." "No, Carlo, you played a dangerous game when you took my wife." Bumpy pulled out the tape recorder, pressed play. Carlo's voice filled the room. "I don't care what Anastasia says. When the time is right, I'm taking over. Albert's getting old, sloppy. 1 bullet, 1 new boss." Carlo stood abruptly. "Turn that off." Bumpy stopped the tape. "That's a death sentence, Carlo. You know it, I know it. Albert Anastasia finds out you're planning his murder, and you'll be dead before sunrise." The room was silent, except for the distant sound of card games in the main room. Carlo Gambino, one of the most powerful mobsters in America, stood behind his desk, staring at evidence that could destroy his entire empire. "What do you want?" Carlo finally asked. "I want my wife, and I want you to never set foot in Harlem again. Not you, not your soldiers, not anyone who answers to you." "That's not reasonable." Neither was kidnapping Mayme. Bumpy leaned forward. "Let me explain something to you, Carlo. I've been building this collection for 15 years. Every boss who ever tried to threaten me, every family that thought they could take what's mine, I documented everything. Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, I have files on all of them." He tapped the briefcase. "This is just yours. And right now, copies of everything in this case are sitting in 3 different locations: a lawyer's office, a safety deposit box, and with a very trustworthy friend. If something happens to me, if something happens to Mayme, if I even hear about one of your soldiers looking at Harlem the wrong way, all of this goes public. The FBI gets the photos. Albert Anastasia gets the tape.
Sal Russo gets the pictures of you with his daughter, and the commission gets the bank statements. Carlo sat back down slowly. His hands were shaking slightly, almost imperceptibly, but Bumpy saw it. "You'd destroy me." "In a heartbeat," Bumpy said. "But I don't want to. Destroying you creates chaos. Chaos is bad for business. So here's what's going to happen instead." Bumpy straightened his tie, his voice calm, methodical. "You're going to apologize to my wife. You're going to provide a car to take us home. And tomorrow morning, you're going to send word to every family in New York that Harlem is off limits. Not because you're afraid of me, because you respect the boundaries."
And if I refuse, then by tomorrow afternoon you'll be dead or in federal prison. Your choice. The silence stretched. 20 seconds. 30. Tony Anastasia stood frozen, hand still near his weapon but not drawing. Mayme sat perfectly still, watching her husband negotiate for her life with the same calm precision he used to cut his steak. Finally, Carlo Gambino did something he'd never done in his entire criminal career. He stood, walked around the desk, and extended his hand to Mayme. "Mrs. Johnson, I apologize. This was a misunderstanding. You were never in danger." Mayme looked at Bumpy, who nodded slightly. She stood, ignored Carlo's hand, and walked directly to her husband. Bumpy put his arm around her, pulled her close.
"We're leaving now," Bumpy said. "Tony will arrange the car." Carlo nodded to Tony, who disappeared through the door. Moments later, he returned. "Car's ready, boss." Bumpy picked up the briefcase, closed it carefully. "One more thing, Carlo. In 3 days, I want to sit down with the commission. You're going to propose that Harlem remains independent territory, black-operated, black-controlled. In exchange, I'll guarantee there are no conflicts with any of the 5 families. Everyone gets to do business in peace." Carlo's eyes narrowed. "You want official recognition. I want what I've earned, respect." Carlo stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 3 days.
"I'll arrange it." Bumpy guided Mayme toward the door, then paused, looked back. "And Carlo? Burn the tape after we leave. Consider it a gift, but know that I have 2 more copies. Insurance."
9:47 p.m. The Lincoln Continental pulled away from Mulberry Street. Mayme sat in the passenger seat, hands folded in her lap, looking straight ahead. They drove in silence for 5 blocks. Then Mayme spoke. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." "I mean the briefcase, the evidence. You could have just gone to war." Bumpy glanced at her. "War would have gotten you killed, or worse. This way you're safe, and Carlo learned a lesson." "What lesson?" "That violence is easy. Anyone can pull a trigger. But strategy, patience, using your enemy's secrets against them, that's power." Mayme reached over, squeezed his hand. "You scared me, Ellsworth." "I was terrified," he admitted quietly. "The whole time?"
"Every second. From the moment Willie told me they'd taken you until the moment I saw you in that chair." They drove through Harlem, past 125th Street, past the spot where Mayme had been taken 9 hours earlier. The oranges were still in the gutter. Broken eggs stained the sidewalk. "I thought you'd come in shooting," Mayme said. "That's what they expected. That's why they took you. They wanted me to react emotionally, make a mistake, give them justification to wipe me out." He pulled up to their building on Edgecombe Avenue. "But I didn't get this far by being predictable." They walked upstairs to their apartment. Everything was exactly as they'd left it that morning. Mamie's coat on the hook, Bumpy's newspaper on the coffee table.
Normal life, interrupted and now resumed. Mayme went to the bedroom, changed out of her wrinkled blue dress. When she came back, Bumpy was sitting at the kitchen table, the briefcase open in front of him, sorting through documents. "Are you really going to keep all that?" she asked. "Every word, every photograph, every recording." "That's a lot of secrets to carry, Ellsworth." He looked up at her. "That's the price of protecting what matters." 3 days later, Bumpy Johnson sat at a table with representatives from all 5 families. Carlo Gambino, as promised, proposed that Harlem be recognized as independent territory. Frank Costello seconded it. Vito Genovese abstained. But the vote passed. For the first time in New York's organized crime history, a black operator was given official recognition and protection by the Italian Mafia.
Not because they respected him, because they feared what he knew. The briefcase stayed locked in Bumpy's safe for the next 12 years. He never had to open it again. Just the knowledge that it existed was enough. Carlo Gambino never sent another soldier into Harlem. He never made another move against Bumpy Johnson. And years later, in 1968, when Bumpy died of a heart attack at Wells Restaurant, Carlo sent flowers to the funeral. The card read simply, "A man of his word." But what most people didn't know, what history books won't tell you, is that on March 4th, 1956, the morning after Mayme was returned safely, Bumpy went back to Morrison's Market. He bought replacement groceries: oranges, eggs, chicken, collard greens.
He brought them home, and Mayme cooked the dinner she'd promised the day before.
They ate in silence, like nothing had happened, because that was the deal Bumpy had made with himself years earlier. His business would never touch their home. And despite everything, despite the kidnapping, despite the briefcase, despite the secrets and the threats, he'd kept that promise. The violence had stayed outside. The love had stayed in. March 3rd, 1956. The day Mayme Johnson was kidnapped became legend in Harlem. Not because of the violence that didn't happen, because of the intelligence that did. Bumpy Johnson proved something that night. You don't need an army to win a war. You just need to know where your enemy is weakest. And for Carlo Gambino, that weakness wasn't his soldiers or his guns. It was his secrets.
The briefcase sat in Bumpy's safe until the day he died. After his funeral, Mayme found it, looked inside, and understood for the first time the weight her husband had carried for 12 years. The photographs, the tapes, the documents. Enough evidence to destroy a dozen powerful men. She sat in their bedroom, holding that briefcase, and cried. Not because Bumpy had kept secrets, because he'd kept them to protect her. 3 days later, Mayme Johnson burned every piece of evidence in their fireplace. The photographs curled and blackened, the tapes melted, the documents turned to ash. She didn't need them anymore. Bumpy was gone. The enemies were old or dead.
And the only thing that mattered now was the memory of a man who'd moved heaven and earth to bring her home safely. If this story of strategy, loyalty, and the power of information over violence moved you, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like if you understand that the most dangerous weapon isn't in your hand, it's in your mind. Share this with someone who needs to hear about real power, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's too late. What would you have done in Bumpy's position? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, the smartest man in the room isn't the one talking the loudest. It's the one holding the secrets everyone else forgot they told.